Welcome back to class. In this session, we're going to be looking at the major themes in primarily Chapter 27 of Jürgen's The Prize, but in the next couple of class sessions, we're going to pay not quite so much attention to outlining chapter by chapter and try to combine some of the themes that extend across chapters. These chapters in the heart of Jürgen can become pretty confusing. You can see how many different themes he's trying to keep in the air of his study, right? But he's also trying to mark periods or eras, and so the chapters sort of jump in subsection to subsection from one theme to the other, and I know that can be kind of confusing. So what we're going to do in the next couple of class sessions is kind of pull apart the different themes and focus on each one in turn. So for this class session, which is the main idea of Chapter 27, we're going to look at the extraordinary increase in energy consumption, hydrocarbon energy consumption, or fossil fuel energy consumption in that 25-year period or so following World War II. We want to think of that as a distinct era from the post-war settlement, the system of international oil distribution that gets created until that international system gets disrupted, if you will, in the mid-1970s with the organization of OPEC and the OPEC oil embargoes. So we want to focus roughly 1945 to 1975, 1950 to 1970, right in that era. And what you notice from the charts on your screen is an absolutely extraordinary, even exponential increase in global energy consumption. If you look at the chart on your lower left, which is United States energy consumption, you'll see that we about doubled our energy consumption in the 25 years or so following World War II. The amount of coal being burned, it remains about constant, and it's the tripling of consumption of natural gas and petroleum that accounts for that doubling of total energy consumption. Now, for the United States, you can see in that chart that that's a very steep line in the area that we're looking for, but it is more or less continuous with the line that preceded it. That is to say, after World War II, the United States continues its breakneck accelerating speed of carbon energy consumption. The chart in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, which illustrates world energy consumption, shows what really defines this as a very unique moment in the history of oil. On a global scale, gas or gasoline energy consumption is going to increase by a factor of about 10, from around 150 million tons of energy, as it's expressed in this graph, to over 1,000 by the end of the period. And oil consumption is going to rise from around 500 million tons of energy to over 2,500 million tons of energy, again in roughly this 20 to 30-year period following the end of World War II. If you notice the kind of ascension, the extreme degree, if you will, of the lines on that chart, you see what an extraordinary change this is on a global scale. And so while the United States continues to be at the forefront of global energy consumption, it's really consistent with the preceding at least half a century, whereas on a global scale there's going to be a radical transformation. And Jürgen describes kind of two main sources of this increase in global carbon energy consumption. The first, he talks about the reconstruction of Europe. If you've seen documentaries or images from the end of World War II, you know that just a vast number of European cities were entirely leveled and rendered to rubble, right, by the bombing of World War II. That then provided an opportunity in the aftermath of the war for a kind of wholesale radical reconstruction of the urban infrastructure of those cities. It would have been most common prior to World War II for major European cities to really be built on the basis of coal energy. That is, coal boilers and individual coal furnaces and apartments and whatnot, that the transportation and shipment and handling of coal would have been the foundation for most European cities. After World War II, They are getting aid from the United States, at least Western Europe, the kind of free world allied with the West. Half of Europe is getting an enormous amount of financial aid from the United States under the Marshall Plan to rebuild their urban infrastructure, and they're going to rebuild it on a petroleum, largely diesel oil basis. And so that transformation in the kind of second most industrially advanced region of the world behind the United States makes a major contribution to the increase in carbon energy consumption. But even more important than the reconstruction of Europe is that literally the entire rest of the planet, which had been living a really pre-industrial lifestyle and had a kind of pre-industrial infrastructure, was all of a sudden, all at once, converting to an oil infrastructure. When we talk about places like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria and Kuwait and etc., these are places that had essentially a pre-industrial lifestyle and production culture, and when they enter the modern world and they become their own autonomous nation states, they want to be able to produce for their citizens and their subjects the same lifestyle standard of living that Western Europeans and Americans experience. And of course, the key to that is an oil infrastructure. So what we're really seeing in that graph in the upper right is, if you will, the developing global south all of a sudden, all at once, in a very short span of time, just in about 20 years or so, all becoming based on oil consumption. Their civilizations, their culture, their standard of living coming depend increasingly upon oil, and of course the related electricity energy production that's based on the consumption of oil. What makes this period truly remarkable, though, is that despite this just astronomical increase in our consumption of oil, we still can't consume as much oil as is being produced. World oil production is outpacing world oil consumption, even as consumption is increasing fantastically. The chart in the upper right shows world oil production, and you'll see in the bottom there the kind of purple pink color that the United States continues a steady rise in its productive capacity, very gentle slope up until just after 1970, when our domestic production will start to decline. But the real increase in production comes from that orange, which is the Middle East, and green is others, which is a category that includes both Latin American oil, primarily Mexico and Venezuelan oil, and also, as we're going to see in coming class sessions, the development of oil resources in North Africa, especially Libya and Algeria. All of these countries are trying to maximize their production in order to reap as many profits as they can from their oil sales, so that they can, remember, these governments are brand new governments trying to prove their legitimacy. So they need to maximize the production of oil, get as many revenues as they can. Think back to the 1850s, right? And the initial boom in the oil industry, and the pressure upon the oil producers to maximize production even though prices remain low. Well, this is a classic boom cycle driven not by kind of the motivations of individual private company investors, entrepreneurs in the United States, but by nation states, by national governments. The government of Saudi Arabia, the government of Iraq, the government of Iran, etc., are putting tremendous pressure on the oil companies to produce as many barrels as they possibly can. So even in an era of extraordinary, seeming infinite consumption of energy, prices nevertheless remain at historic lows. And that's what the chart at the bottom left-hand screen of the show shows, is that we're watching the last phase of that Texas era, the period of really unusual price stability and low prices at the same time. This is the golden era of global energy production and consumption. It's a period in which it seems that the world's oil resources are literally inexhaustible, right? And so We have a tendency to think of this as the normal period and the crisis boom bust periods on either side of it as unusual, as the system breaking down. But when you see it in context, what you realize is what an extraordinarily unique moment this is. This is the unusual phase, this long period of price stability and essentially oil surplus in the world. And the lifestyle, the products that were developed and the choices made about urban design and whatnot during this period reflect that culture, or that the psyche of the period, that energy was inexhaustible into the future. So let's look now at the main theme for Jurgen in chapter 27, which is the way American lifestyle changed in the post-World War II period, reflecting the consumption of hydrocarbon energy. Cars, of course, are the iconic symbol of the age, and the explosion of car ownership, not just in the United States, but around the world, is the most tangible kind of lifestyle change that, if you don't want to say ordinary people, at least working class people around the world, it becomes the symbol of participation in this new future world that we're creating in the post-war period. The graph on your screen shows an explosion in global car production. We start at the end of World War II. If you look at that dip around 1940, 1945 there, car production virtually comes to a standstill during the period of the war. We pick up then, say, around 5, 6, 7 million cars being produced a year, almost all of them within the United States. And we're going to end around 1970 with nearly 40 million cars being produced in the world, in countries all around the world. So something like an 800% increase in the volume of car production. The bottom green portion of that graph is the United States, and if you see the couple of dips there for the Great Depression in the early 30s, and then of course again for World War II, otherwise the United States is sort of following a slow, steady trajectory of increasing car production. The story, the real story here in the couple of decades following the end of World War II is the growth of car production in other countries around the world. The light blue there is the rise of the Japanese automakers, and between the light blue and the dark green at the bottom are all the European manufacturers. The British and the Germans and the French and the Italians are making all those European brands that we're familiar with. For people all around the world, a kind of increasing mark of middle class status, of kind of entry into the 20th century world of technology, is ownership of a car. If you're a car collector or a car enthusiast, you'll recognize these classic stylings of American cars in the 1950s and the 1960s. The first thing that should grab your attention is just how large these things are, right? These are, if you're familiar with, sort of car construction methods, this is really like quarter-inch steel I-beam frames and, 32nd inch, 16th inch rolled steel body frames attached to it, and giant big block V8s, right, that are getting 7, 8, 9, maybe 10 miles to the gallon given the weight of these things. Notice how futuristic the advertising images are. Notice how large the automobiles are in reference to the human figures. They're almost like tanks, right, from the World War II period, or armored personnel carriers. Notice in the image in the lower left, the Oldsmobile advertisement, that jet airplane up in the upper right-hand corner of that advertisement, and how the car, the body stylings are trying to replicate these futuristic images. And notice in the Chevy ad in the bottom center, the 2-car garage for the family, right? There's no, the increasing expectation, both mom and dad need a car to get around and carry out their responsibilities. The car is becoming increasingly integrated into our domestic culture and domestic lifestyles. All of these cars are going to need new and better roads to drive on, right? So the road system of the early 20th century that we looked at in previous class sessions is really designed to carry traffic. Those early cars may weigh 500, maybe 1,000 pounds, and they can go 35, 40, 45 miles an hour on thin, knobby tires. These new, heavier cars of the post-war period can go much faster. They're much heavier, and we're going to start developing heavy semi trucks, right, and truck trailer loads. All of this needs a dramatic investment in road construction. Jurgen tells the story of the Interstate Highway Bill that's adopted in 1956, and it's really going to be still well into the 70s before we complete all of the major trunks here. But again, just like we talked about in the earlier class sessions, this giant federal expenditure, think of the amount of dollars it would take to buy all this concrete and pay all these laborers to lay these thousands upon thousands of miles of freeway. Well, for every mile of freeway, you have to imagine 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles of interconnecting state highways. That is, all of those roads that are in existence essentially have to be rebuilt to modern automobile standards. So there is an astronomical investment in road construction in the post-war period, and those new roads are going to transform our kind of residential living patterns. We're going to develop the suburbs and a suburban style of living. You see the advertisements here for these different suburban ranch homes. The image at the bottom is of Levittown, which Jurgen mentions. The Levitt brothers are a construction company in New York, and they sort of expanded to Western New York and Pennsylvania, and their model gets replicated by construction outfits all over the country. This is essentially the standardization of housing construction. It's in this period that we start all those S4 lumber sizes, right? Your 4x8 sheets of plywood and drywall. All those 2x4s come out identically. They're actually 1.5 by 3.5 inches, right? But pre-cut to 8 foot or 92 and 3/8 inches for the pre-cut studs. The kind of factory production of standard sizes of lumber allow construction outfits like the Levitt brothers to go in and buy up, say, 1,000 acres of farm field, lay out a couple of hundred housing plots, and lay out the street system, put in the sewers and the electric lines beforehand, build the house. Now they're going to do it on a standard model. You're all familiar. If you're from the Metro Detroit area, you're very familiar with these neighborhoods where there's 1 or 2 or 3 housing styles you can pick from. You got the ranch, you got the colonial, you got the bi-level, and these neighborhoods have hundreds and hundreds of homes with the same basic 3 or 4 patterns. Well, what that allows you to do then is pre-order all your lumber pre-cut and have it show up on the train. Your work crews can build dozens of houses all to the same floor plan, and it dramatically decreases the cost of construction. So the combination of decreasing construction costs and decreasing land costs as freeways allow builders to reach out further and further from town centers, right? The classic suburban development allows families, middle-class families, working-class families, to purchase a kind of lifestyle that was virtually inconceivable prior to World War II. If you think of all the neighborhoods around Metro Detroit that essentially follow those patterns, the first people to buy those homes would have been factory workers accustomed to kind of tenement housing, apartment living in inner cities prior to the capacity to buy this kind of lifestyle. It really is a revolution in the living standards of middle class and working class people in America. And you see this kind of image of domesticity in the advertisement on the lower left-hand side of your screen. Live better, right? And there's dad coming home from work and mom and the boy grabbing him by the arm, and they're going to their nuclear family domicile, right? The image of domesticity here and the kind of family values or cultural values being communicated. It all revolves around the development of the suburbs. This is living in the future. It's spacious, right? You have to get out and mow your yard. You could have baseball games in the backyard. This is a style of living that becomes deeply seated in American kind of economic values and values of middle class prosperity. The car is also going to become essential to public life in the post-World War II period. And these suburbs are their urban design and transportation layout is going to have to accommodate the idea that everybody's going to go everywhere in their car and they're going to go one or two people or per family unit and even subdivide now that we have two cars per family everywhere they go. So you see the rise of the classic suburban shopping mall in the image in the top right hand corner of your screen. If you've taken transportation design or urban design classes, then you'll be familiar that you commonly need double the square footage of the whole plot, double the square footage devoted to parking spaces for cars as store space within the mall, right? So somewhere between double or more of the square footage. And of course, then you need the ring roads and the intersections to accommodate all of this traffic. So the expanse of land that you need devoted to this one recreation or business center. The classic image of a fancy shopping trip before World War II would be you'd take the train or the subway down to a downtown urban area, right? You'd get off at a subway station or a train station, maybe within a few blocks of the store that you would want to go to. You would walk those blocks in a kind of high rise, small towns would have just a few stories tall, big cities would have many, 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 many stories tall, high rise buildings, and the stores would be intermixed with residential and commercial living space, right? This image that you see of the suburban shopping mall is a radically different way of thinking about the marketplace, economic activity, and the way individuals interact with it. And it's going to require, and this is futuristic in the 1950s and the 1960s because you're in the open air, and of course you're more autonomous. You can get into your car and go wherever you want to go and come back to your destination. You're not dependent on public transportation and all those other things. And then you see that sort of leisure activity also becomes oriented around the car. So one of the kind of classic iconic images of the 1950s is the drive-in diner, where you can just come in and park with your car with all of your friends, and the servers will come out to your car and take your order and then deliver your food. And you may have seen movies from the 1950s or 1960s where these would be sort of hangout spots in the weekend evenings where teenagers would come, and it's a kind of party scene around the drive-in diner. And also drive-in movie theaters, as you see the image below. And the advertisement on the right-hand side of your screen is actually for a Detroit called the West Side Drive-In at the corner of 8 Mile and Schaefer. You literally would drive, everybody would park in a huge parking lot in front of a giant screen, and they would blare the soundtrack from loudspeakers beside the screen. Everybody just sits inside of your car. Would take your family, take your date, whatever, and you just sit inside your car and you watch the movie with the soundtrack being blared over the loudspeakers. If you think again about the amount of space being devoted and the kind of cultural psychology or social psychology being inculcated through these images. If you look at that image of all those cars parked in front of the movie screen, think of how reminiscent this is in the 1950s of the kind of images people would have seen during World War II in that combat footage. Imagine those are all, say, tanks, right? You've got a little tank crew in each subunit, but they all have to have sort of amazing choreography and cooperation in order to all know how to pull into perfect alignment like that, right? There's a kind of social psychology that instructs people how to operate in this. It's not militaristic, they're just hanging out watching a movie, but that kind of rehearsal, right? That ability to fall in line and march in lockstep and come up with a perfect pattern is being replicated, but within the automobile. In dozens of different ways, the car is becoming essential to our lifestyle, especially in the United States. But again, as we mentioned, cultures all around the world are trying to replicate what they see in the images in American magazines and movies and television shows and whatnot. And this is the future. Of course, there are an endless number of other inventions besides the car. in the post-war period that contribute substantively to that increased energy consumption we saw at the beginning of the class session. This is the origins of the era of climate control. The essential invention here, now we've understood radiators and the cooling effect of, passing cold water through pipes. The Lennox said in the lower left-hand corner that we now have a device you can just set your thermostat to say 68, 69 degrees, and if the temperature drops below that, your furnace will kick on and maintain it at 68 or 69, and if the temperature goes above that, your air conditioning will kick on and lower it to 68 or 69. And this notion that we could move through life in a constant state of perfectly moderate and accommodating temperature really is an image of the luxury of the suburban lifestyle. Now, as you see, the ability to make air conditioners portable means urban areas, right, downtown areas are going to be able to quickly convert to air conditioning. Refrigerators are going to be revolutionized in the post-war period because we can also adapt this technology to freezers and refrigerators. This is one of the largest contributors to energy consumption. Of course, air conditioning is dramatically consumptive of electricity. Routine, daily, uninterrupted access to electricity is going to become a lifestyle norm in the post World War II period. One of the revolutionary aspects of that Levittown construction method, that mass production of housing, is that you can essentially hardwire the grid before you ever lay your first foundation or put your first roof on your first house. You can in addition to all of these innovations that really depend on the energy released by the burning of oil or gasoline, right? That depend on the power derived from gasoline. There's also an endless number of innovations in the post-war period of using petroleum as a base material for a variety of different applications. The development of polymer technology, or the chemistry breakthrough and the innovation, the development of polymers, allows for the development of plastics. Now, plastics are going to have an endless number of kind of industrial applications that will use plastic parts for all kinds of different machinery. But it also has, as you see in these images on the screen, leads to a wide variety of consumer products that are going to change our suburban lifestyles. You see the image of the Tupperware in the bottom images on your screen. Now, Tupperware is one of those products that became so famous, so ubiquitous, that the name of the company became synonymous with the product itself, a little bit like Kleenex or something like that. But there's any number of kind of home applications for these plastics. You may have a Formica table, your grandparents down in the basement that you grew up playing cards on or something, some beat up old Formica table. You see the advertisement there. And you may have in an old house still see the original asphalt tile flooring. That's essentially asphalt embedded in plastic used as flooring tile. And of course, this wonderful image on the upper left hand side of your screen with the baby in a plastic bag and the stork. And that really, the shocking kind of nature of that image as a 21st century person, your first thought might have been that was a dead fetus, right, in a trash bag. It does not look wholesome and futuristic to us, right? These products look dated. They look sort of anachronistic to us. And it's really hard to capture how futuristic, kind of space age these products were in the 1950s and the 1960s. Why would a healthy baby in a plastic bag be a positive, reinforcing image, encourage you to buy that product? The recurring theme here, besides if you look at the confetti flooring advertisement, the captions at the bottom, the middle caption says it's plastic fortified for long wear, dazzling colors, and effortless cleaning. So these shapes and the colors look really new. If you think of the television shows and the movies in a space age future, they have these kind of bubble chairs, right? These shapes of furniture that we were never able to achieve before with wood or metal. You can make all kinds of shapes and dye them these colors, but it's really about the cleanliness, right? This is sanitized. The reason that image of the baby in the trash bag or in the plastic bag is a positive image in the 1950s and 1960s is that baby is being kept safe from germs and viruses and disease. And to really understand the kind of emotional attachment, the utility and emotional attachment to the product of plastic, you have to understand that for thousands and thousands of years, humans have been struggling against infection and disease, right? It's one of the most ubiquitous threats to our lifestyle and our longevity, right? Our lifespan, if you will. What all of these kind of home products communicate, what these advertisements are communicating, is cleanliness, the ability to sanitize and get rid of germs, that it's long lasting, that it's bright colored, all that's wonderful. Think about, in a pre-plastics world, going to the grocery store and going to the butcher and buying meat. How does that meat come? How is it wrapped, right? You have primitive refrigeration, right, in the pre-World War II period, but you're getting it essentially wrapped in paper, or you're just getting raw meat and you're putting it in a cloth bag to carry it home. Think about rotting vegetables, rotting fruit, and whatnot, and the constant challenges within the household of people becoming sick. And in a pre-vaccine, pre-penicillin antibiotic world, you can get sick, and it can be lethal or it can lead to long-term disabilities. This is one of the most kind of foundational fears of human civilization is our, think about getting rid of waste, right? Human waste and excrement and the constant battle of villages, towns, and cities to remove that human waste from the household because that waste is a source of infection. What all this plastic imagery is communicating to consumers in the 1950s and 1960s is cover your house in plastic, get a mop bucket with a gallon of bleach, fill it up with water and bleach, and just start dousing this thing with bleach, right? And you've got a sanitized, clean environment for your family to be raised in. Your children will be healthy and protected from germs and disease. And that's really a psychologically powerful message to communicate to consumers, right? As they're trying to protect their family, and and that's why these plastic images look so futuristic, right? They look like the magic lifestyle of the future where everybody is kept safe and free from germs and infection within the family domestic sphere. One final example here, Jürgen mentions in passing the development of fertilizers as one example of the oil companies looking for products to develop because there's such a glut of oil on the market in the 50s and 60s that they're desperate to sell it in any way that they can. So Jürgen does mention fertilizers in passing, but the emergence of what we call phosphate agriculture, or you may have heard the term soil science, really in terms of global health conditions, right? Global life expectancy and life conditions, and thinking about the long history of man from early civilization to this moment in time, the development of phosphate fertilizers had probably a more profound effect than all of the other innovations we've been talking about in this class session. The key discoveries in kind of plant biology that come to identify the key nutrients for plant horticulture or kind of agriculture are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Right? Those are the key elements that plants need to grow. There's a variety of others, but those are the primary ones. Those discoveries are made in kind of the late 19th and early 20th century. So there's an early understanding that long precedes this, if you will, in the kind of botany, if you will, or the biological science of agriculture. And as you see in the chart in the upper left, the application of phosphates to fields starts right around the turn of the century. It's part of the early experiments, you could say, during the kerosene age. One of the primary challenges of agriculture on a scale beyond you got sort of the family garden plot, right, where you live in a very simple dwelling and you're just trying to grow enough vegetables to support your own family. That you can sustain with kind of waste from the woods nearby, and if you have livestock, using their waste for fertilizer. But the challenge really is agriculture on any scale beyond that, because one of the great kind of dynamics of agriculture is the plants deplete the nutrients in the soil. So typically, if you have kind of unbroken frontier land and you break open a field and you plant it, you can get, depending on the crop, how much nutrients each plant uses. Corn is very different than potatoes, is very different than cotton or tobacco. But you may have 2, 3, 4, 5 years that you can plant that field before the natural nutrients in the soil are depleted. And so then you have a couple of choices. You can add nutrients to the soil, and you would do that primarily with like cow poop and pig poop and stuff, and you mix it in, and you can go into the woods and find plants that have fallen. But then you have to wait years, right? You're essentially creating a giant compost pile, and you can then wait years for all that material to break down, the manure to break down, rake it and turn it over. Then you can go back to that field. Now when you go back to it, it's only going to give you maybe this time 2 or 3 years harvest. And you can do the alternative in a pre-industrial, pre-phosphate fertilizer world is you can allow that field to just go fallow, right? So you need 10 acres of corn, right, to contribute to the village, your contribution to the village. Well, if you need 10 acres of corn, then you need something like 50 acres of farmland because you're only going to keep 10 acres in production at any given time, and the rest has to lie unplanted, and you'll do it in little 10-acre sections over the course of decades, right? And that's known as field rotation. Both of those things put a severe limitation on the productivity of farmland. And this is one of the basic challenges to human civilization going back thousands and thousands of years. What you see in the chart in the upper left is the dramatic increase in phosphate fertilizer application, not just in the United States, this is around the world, and the consequent dramatic increase in agricultural productivity and grain production. And in the center bottom of the screen, looking at wheat, global wheat production. We're going to double and then triple our total kind of global agriculture's capacity to produce foodstuffs. Those increases are going to support a dramatic increase in the world population. If you look at the graph at the top right hand of your screen, from sort of the dawn of human civilization up to around 1800, it took us that long to achieve a global population of 1 billion people. So something like 50,000 years on the planet to get to 1 billion human beings on the planet. It then took us just over a century, about 120 years to get to 2 billion people, then just a little over 30 years to get to 3 billion people, about 15 years to get to 4 billion people, and then about a dozen years or so each to add to 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion, and we're now roughly just around 8 billion people in the world. That dramatic increase in the global population was made possible by the revolution in agriculture produced by phosphate fertilizers, right? The primary limitation on human population is food scarcity and malnourishment, which then leads to a greater incidence of disease and the lethality of what would be otherwise, right? You, in good times when the crops are flush, you might survive that bout of pneumonia when you're well fed. In lean years, when the crops were lean and there wasn't much hunting and the animals are scarce in the woods, that bout of pneumonia might well kill you, right? And that's what limits human population really until the middle of the 20th century, when human population just absolutely explodes. The distribution of fertilizer from the oil company's perspective in terms of developing products, what's fantastic about fertilizer is that you can derive these nuggets, these phosphate compounds, from the waste material. This is essentially going back to the sludge that we're trying to refine out of crude oil, right? We're trying to refine it into both diesel and gasoline and high octane gasoline, and at each stage we're removing sludge out of that crude oil. Well, those phosphorus compounds, those molecules that we're trying to identify, are in that sludge waste. So this was basically stuff they were throwing away, right, in the early ages of oil refining. And all of a sudden, they've discovered this miracle product out of the waste. And this will become one of the primary sources of American aid to developing, sort of poor developing countries around the world. When the United States or the United Nations and the Western powers go into these places and they want to help them improve their living standards, one of the first things that we will do is deliver fertilizer, shiploads of fertilizer, either free or very, very cheap, and teach the local farmers how the science of soil agriculture, that is, determining, both replenishing the nutrients in the soil, but also sort of testing your soil. If your soil already has tons of, say, potassium in it, then you can manipulate these compounds of these fertilizers to balance the soil, the relative ratios of these nutrients, both whatever the native conditions are and also to whatever kind of crop you happen to be trying to grow. Different crops like different mixtures of these basic elements. That kind of American aid, the free giving of American science here is going to revolutionize agriculture in places like India and Brazil and in Southeast Asia and in the west coast of Africa and places that were accustomed to kind of routine episodic famines because of agriculture failures, which is a completely normal condition of trying to grow crops on any scale. We're going to essentially solve that limitation in the second half of the 20th century. And there's probably nothing that came out of this post-World War II period that more dramatically impacted the living conditions and the life chances of literally billions of people around the planet than this innovation. So we'll leave that here, and then in the next class session we will pick up with chapter 28 and the politics of the post-war period.